What's going on? This is the King Cam Ujumbe Podcast, and Ujumbe means message. And today's message is a king's authority and power. Yeah, we about to get into it. The Ethiopian life in the Middle Ages. I hope all is well with you. Get you something right on, something to write with, and let's get to it. This is a another episode dealing with Ethiopia, and I'm happy about that. So we're talking about a king's authority and power. So let's go. So here are some of the questions. Here's some of the questions. How did the Zigwe dynasty differ from the Solomonic line in terms of legitimacy, religious authority, and governance? Okay. Why were instant capitals a unique feature of Ethiopian monarchy? Who is the Abun? Abun. Okay. And number four, what were the medieval ties? Who were they connected with? There were some other nations in and around them that they interacted with. All right, let's go. So today we're going to talk about the social structure and daily life in medieval Ethiopia, economic activities and trade routes, political organization and kingdom interactions. Okay, the powers of the monarch and the royal succession, the moving or instant capitals, the church and its abun, and medieval ties. All right, so yeah, this is the Ethiopia, Kush, and Kemet connection. We are discussing all the nations and empires in and along the Nile Valley. And so, once again, I'd like to welcome you guys to King Cam Ujumbe Podcast. So, we're taking a journey through Ethiopia's rich and complex history. Okay, this this is something, okay? This is some high level upperclassmen type stuff. Some of you guys have been with me for a couple of years now, so you guys got a better understanding as to what I say and why I say this is upper level, upperclassmen type stuff. You see what I'm saying? This is You're getting better. You guys are growing in knowledge, so I figured we go further into detail, right? So before we get into those events of the modern era, we need to ground ourselves in the medieval era, right? The medieval period, the heartbeat of Ethiopian life in the Middle Ages. So this was a time of faith. It had trade going on, economic structure, economic power, and sacred traditions. Okay, this is a time when Ethiopia stood as a beacon of Christianity in Africa. All right. Yet lived in constant dialogue, sometimes peaceful, and sometimes it got a little hectic. Okay. Especially when it came down to the Muslim neighbors and other Christian kingdoms, right? So we're dealing with the four pillars, of course. This is pillar one, Ethiopia, the source and the sanctuary. Pillar number two, Kemet, the blueprint of sacred civilization. Pillar number three, Cushion Nubia, the corridor continuity. And pillar number four, the hidden code, spiritual science symbols, and the esoteric legacy of Africa. So we're dealing with the first pillar, which is Ethiopia. That is our mother. That is our home. This is our foundation. A lot of people ask me, why don't I do other things and delve into other concepts? I would like to, but this is what if this is what we're going to be known for, I'd rather us be known for these things here: Ethiopia, Kemet, and Kush, and a little bit of comedic science and a little bit of symbolism, right? All right, let's go. So now we got to deal with, before we get into the medieval ages, we got to get them, before we deal with the kings, before we deal with the authorities and everything, we got to deal with the social structure and daily life. So in medieval Ethiopia, society was shaped like the mountains that defined the land, right? It was layered and interconnected. At the top stood the emperor or the king, seen not as a ruler, but as a divinely chosen descendant of King Solomon. We discussed King Solomon and Queen Makeda before. Now, below him were the nobles, right? They were the other rulers or the governors, right? Who controlled provinces and ensured the emperor's word was carried out. Then we had the clergy. Yeah, we had the clergy. These preachers, these ministers held immense influence because we as Africans are very spiritual people, right? We are very, um, very deep. and philosophical people. So we want to see the spirit in everything. So when it comes down to the religious matters in Ethiopia, the clergy had immense influence, right? The Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo Church was the keeper of spiritual life, education, and moral authority, all right? And monks in remote monasteries guarded ancient manuscripts while priests led liturgies in the lyrical Ge'ez language, Geez, Ge'ez language, which is very complex based on from what I'm understanding. Now, most people during the medieval time, most people, however, lived as farmers and herders, and they're tied to the rhythms of the seasons, and life revolved around the Orthodox calendar. Okay, with its fasts and feasts and communities, they came together for harvest festivals, marriages, and religious processions. Everything revolved in and around the Ethiopian church, right? So it was a life, the medieval era, the medieval period was a life that was humble and yet rich. It was humble in possessions and knowledge and rich in tradition and faith. So, but here's the thing though, if you are enjoying the content, if you are enjoying this information, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you want to know more about Ethiopia, Kush and Kemet, you're at the right place. Let's get it. Now, economic activity, economic activity and trade routes. Um, Ethiopia's economy in the Middle Ages was as diverse in its geography, but it's also diverse in the way it handles its finances, right? In the fertile highlands, they had teff, they had barley, they had wheat, and that food sustained the population. They also had coffee. And I found out, shout out to the family of Ethiopia, I found out that Ethiopia is known for its coffee. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, y'all like and comment below. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they produce they produce most of the world's coffee. I thought it was in South America. Who knew, right? So coffee would later become one of Ethiopia's great exports, began its journey here in the southern regions, right? But now, Ethiopia wasn't isolated. Okay, Ethiopia wasn't isolated. It was plugged into vast trade networks, right? You know, I like maps. We gotta get it. So this is, of course, modern day Ethiopia, but we have to understand during this time there was no borders. There was no state lines in a sense, right? Ethiopia basically covered the majority of this place, right? And so Ethiopia wasn't isolated. It was plugged into vast trade networks from the ports of Zila, right there, the ports of Zila, and then and Massawa. They had trade routes all over the place here. Okay. And guess what? They carry, get this, they carry gold, ivory, and precious animal hides and precious animal skins out to the Red Sea, into the Indian Ocean. So in exchange, what they got, see, you gotta give something to get something, right? So in return, what they got from the Far East, they brought back salt, textiles, spices from Arabia, India, and beyond, right? And this is another illustration of the trade routes. You see, they're going from Ethiopia or Aksum, depends on the time period, and they're going in and around the Red Sea, going all the way up to the Mediterranean and all the way back down, even into Sudan and westward. And from then you see Ethiopia right here, which is connected to the Blue Nile or Aksum, and they're going eastward to India. Caravans, they had caravans snaked through the deserts, through the hills and the mountains, connecting the highlands to the coast. And so these routes were more than, say, commercial lifelines. These were cultural highways, places of knowledge, carrying new ideas, goods, and services. And sometimes it got a little friction. They got active. Okay, when money is involved, you know how people go, right? So, but here's the thing: if you ever want to know more about the trade route, check out we did do a discussion about ancient Ethiopia and Arabia's secret cultural exchange. There is a video out there, check that out. And power players in the Indian Oceans, the trading legends. Yeah, we had the discussion before. And if you want to know more detail about the trade routes and how the money was flowing or whatever in East Africa, check it out. All right. Now, we have political organization. We have political organization and kingdom interactions. All right. So this was the thing. Now we dealt with the social aspect of it. We dealt with the economic aspect of medieval Ethiopia. Now we're gonna get into some politics, right? Politically, politically, medieval Ethiopia was both a centralized empire and a patchwork of semi kind of autonomous regions. You see what I'm saying? Very loosely connected under one banner, kind of, sort of, maybe depends on the situation. The emperor's power was strongest in the northern Christian highlands. He was very strong, say, in the north, right? He was strong in the north up here, right? And so, um, but in the lowlands down south, in the frontier areas, and the local rulers, sometimes Christian, sometimes Muslim, depends on who they are, negotiated their own arrangements with the crown. Up north, he was the king of the north, but he may not be king of the south. Like in Kemet, where he was the Insubiti or the Simatawi, where he is the king of the north and south. In Ethiopia, there was a little bit more negotiation happening. There was a little bit more discussion happening. They had alliances. They had alliances that were sealed through, for example, marriage. Okay, trade arrangements were made or military support. It had to be a little give and take, even in Ethiopia. Okay, at times these relationships produced unity, and also at other times they fueled a little rebellion. So the balance between central throne and regional power would be a reoccurring theme in Ethiopia history. Even up until now, we see some much love and peace and love to the family of Ethiopia. There's some frictions that's still there. It happens periodically, but we have to pray for peace and unity in Sudan and Ethiopia, right? Oh, sorry. Let's go. So we talked about social structure in daily life, economic activities and trade routes, political organization and kingdom interaction. Now, we're about to get into the powers of the monarch and the royal succession, the moving or instant capitals, the church and its abun, and medieval ties. Because they was connected to each other in some ways, but they was also connected to other people, right? Let's get it. The powers of the monarch and the royal succession. Where the book? Where the book? Where the book? Here it is. All right. This is the book that we're coming out of, The Ethiopians, A History by Richard Pankhurst. We're in chapter 4. We are in chapter 4. I hope you guys are following along. If you're not, get the book. The affiliate link is in the description. Check it out. So, this is what he says. This is what Richard Pankhurst said. He said two significant differences between medieval and earlier times should, however, be noted. Firstly, the use of coin money. They had coin money back then. Okay, they had it during the Axumite period. And so now trade was instead based on either barter. They went from coin money, from gold and basically gold, to trade. Then the second difference was that the stationary capitals such as Aksum and Lalibela were things of the past. What did they do with that? Okay, well, how did they adjust? They had to address this money issue. Now, where is the seat of power? Okay, so according to Pankhurst, okay, the monarchs of medieval Ethiopia stood like the predecessors at the apex of a great hierarchy of state. Now, the status of the ruler was defined in the Feta Nagast, or the Law of Kings, right? Enunciating the divine right of kings on the basis of Holy Writ or the Bible. The code quoted Christ's command in the book of, it says Matthew chapter 22, verse 21, and basically it's saying, render Caesar unto Caesar, and the things that are Caesar, and unto God the things that are God. So even this concept was even more prominent where the words of St. Paul, uh, when he talked to the Romans, was also cited. It said, "Let every soul be subject to unto higher powers." Okay, for there is no power but of God. So the powers that be are ordained by God. So they are leaning on that divine right to rule, divine kingship. Okay, if they are king, therefore they are divine. So that's their stance. They're taking a biblical and authoritative stance, right? So now the power. So it's power and authority, right? The power, Ethiopian monarchs were theoretically endowed with immense powers. Okay, so the ruler supremacy, in fact, however, varied greatly from reign to reign. It really depends. Just unlike say in Kemet, where if you was named and made and named king, you had all the rights and privileges of such. In Ethiopia, not so much, right? So, the imperial power was probably at its greatest during the time of the great centralizing emperor Zara Yaqub. Zara Yaqub, okay, and he lived between in 1434 to 1468. His chronicle states that he inspired a great terror among the people of Ethiopia, who trembled in front of him, and when he appeared, they fled before him and took up a cranative and respectful position. He ruled with this dude Zara Yaqub ruled with absolute power, and people was afraid of him. I kind of get it, but I don't get it, especially when you're trying to unify the people, right? But what do you think? Was he right in, especially with all these fractions and all these issues in the state of Ethiopia? Do you think Zara Yaqub was right in exuding absolute power like this? Y'all let me know. So we have power. The next thing we have authority. Now, the authority of the king or the ruler rested in large measure on his ability to appoint and dismiss provincial and other officials virtually at will. He was able to appoint or let go people whenever he felt like it, as well as to transfer land to and from them at his pleasure. He's using the Bible to say, hey, the power is given unto me from on high, kind of thing, right? But I do understand the importance of delegation. You can't do everything and you can't be everywhere. But to appoint and dismiss just on a whim, I don't know. I don't know. Right? So, but let's continue. This was noted. This observation was noted by Portuguese traveler Francisco Alvarez, describing the powers of Emperor Lebna Dengel. Lebna Dengel. Okay, over he states that the king whom he calls him the Prester. So this guy from Portuguese is saying Lemda de Gale is Prester John. We've been looking for him the whole time, this whole time, and this Portuguese person saying Lemda de Gale is Prester John. Well, let me close the book then. We found him, right? All right, so um, he states that the king whom he terms Prester appointed and disposed officials whenever he pleased. These changes of personnel were so widely practiced. It was done so often that he comments that it created no ill humor. That nobody felt any kind of way about it. If there was any, it was kept secret. So these people did not feel bad about being let go upon it. It is what it is, right? And so Alvarez also vividly portrays the manner in which the monarch he overruled his governors, describing the recall of one such official the way that he had to humble himself before entering the royal presence. Okay, here's a little bit about it. Here's a little bit about it. The Lord approaches the court with great pomp and takes up quarters at least a league from the court, where he often stays a month or two without stirring. No problem. He hangs out there for about a couple of months. They treat them, or the chiefs, as if they were forgotten as long as the presser chooses. So the king basically is ignoring these cats, right? So they, the chiefs, do not, however, refrain while thus forgotten from coming to court and speaking to the other lords, but not with pomp or robe, but with 2 or 3 men and stripped from the waist upwards, and with sheepskin over their shoulders, so they return to their tents until they have permission to come. They've been out there for months and hanging out there, and the king just ignoring them. He said, "Okay, yeah, yeah, come on, come on, what you want?" That's what they do. And when they get his permission, they enter with great pomp or display and playing the kettle drums and instruments and camp in their place, which is already ordained for each. When the chief, when he the chief, that's what he's talking about. When he the chief encamps, he does not appear clothed as he does when he makes his entry, but walks out or walks about as before his entry, naked from the waist upwards. So they say so and so is not yet in favor with the Lord, for he still goes about stripped. So you gotta basically expose yourself in a sense. You gotta basically put yourself out there before so the king can recognize you. I wonder if we still do that. I still wonder if we still kind of play by those rules. Play by those rules. I don't know. So but of course, when the king finally does decide to entertain this person, that's when the discussion happens, right? Let's continue. Let's go. So now there was there was an issue. There was an issue with secession. Okay, emphasizing the weakness in provincial rulers and so on. There is an issue with secession. Why is that? Why is there problems with? Because normally, if you were the son of a king or the daughter of a king, you next. I I don't know. According in medieval Ethiopia, when he had governors, we had chiefs, we had priests, all vying for power. There was some issues with secession. How did they handle that? How did they do that? Despite its immense power, the monarchy suffered from major weaknesses in connection with the secession until the reign of say Emperor Naud, Naod, Naud 14. He was 1494 to 1508. Every emperor, according to Alvarez, according to the Portuguese person, had 5 or 6 wives. Had a lot of wives, just like Solomon, and therefore they had a lot of sons, or most of them. Such children were all these children were actual or potential claimants to the throne. They all had the right. But like in Kemet though, the chief queen, the chief wife, their child the child from the chief wife got first. They was first in line. But this, it's like equal opportunity. Anybody can get it, right? You know what I'm saying? So good. All right, so the royal inheritance was, in consequence, often very uncertain, right? So Alvarez recalls, this is the Portuguese guy. Alvarez recalls that it was often said that the eldest born inherited it, but others claimed that it was on the contrary. So it was some bickering there, right? So others again declared that the um, inheritor should have the most support. But then religion gets involved because then the Abun or patriarch was told that they should uh should vie for position. Yeah. The Portuguese author for this part believed that the latter assertion was most correct. For the then Abun or patriarch of the church had told the Portuguese person that he and the dowager queen or great grandmother Empress Eleni had placed Lebna Dengel, oppressed her, on the throne. So the religious folk put Prester in place. But now them sons we don't know. Yeah, 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 yeah. But here's the thing: what happens when they get older? What happens, right? What happens? Here's another difficulty arising from the absence of any clear line of succession was that minors were often selected in the place of the season. So they would put a boy in place of as king. Why is that? so they can tell him what to do and tell him to agree to everything and keep it moving. I wonder that's how they did King Tut though. He was just a boy. He was just 8 years old when he ascended to the throne. So it was a lot of powerful people in that camp that had some sway, that had some pull. You know what I'm saying? So they got so if there wasn't a clear succession, they would get a prince. They would get somebody that's eight, that's young, right? This is because the nobles who prefer freedom under a youth than chaff under a strong emperor. They want to do whatever the heck they want to do. Because if it was an older guy who know the rules, who know the effects of the gods, who knows the rules and regulations and everything, they would have issues, right? So one final problem though, connected with the succession, that the death of an emperor frequently led to the collapse of royal authority. Yeah, the kingdom would collapse. Yeah, government after that would be left was temporarily without a king. Okay, so this difficulty, according to the author, was particularly serious when a monarch was unexpectedly killed in battle, whereupon his army, as he will see more than once in these pages, would often just disappear. He leads the military in battle. He's taken out. The military just goes. So there was some. They may put a prince in place. That's uncertain. We're not sure about that. Then another problem is when the king dies in war. Okay. But what about the others? What about the other sons, right? To protect the society and government, according to the author, from conflicts over succession, because there's armies everywhere, there's different factions everywhere, there's nobles, there's priests everywhere. They developed a situation by detaining an unwanted royal contender to the throne. They basically put a prince in jail. If they didn't like him that much, they put him in a royal prison. You royalty, but we don't like you like that. That's wild. You're born royalty, but nobody really like you like that. So they put you over there out yonder somewhere. They put you in a royal prison. This practice was dated back to the Axumite times, when the mountain of Debre Damo had served as a royal prison. A mountain. They used a mountain as a prison. That's tough. That's tough. Use a mountain. Yeah, you ain't getting out of there. Yeah, yeah, that's what they did. So, but if you enjoying this, hit the subscribe button. You know what I'm saying? So let's get it. Let's go. Let's go. Now, so there was some other things. There was some land issues, and there was some concerns with property and who had it and who. And so most people that were not royals or nobles, the common people didn't have a lot of property, right? They worked the land, but they didn't have it. So that was the issues with secession. Issues with secession was there was not a direct line of authority in the sense where who was going to be next, and if they didn't like you, um, they would pick the youngest person or put you in jail. That's wild. This is medieval Ethiopia, though. This is what's going on, right? Now, so talk about social structure and daily life, economic activities and trade routes, political organizations and kingdom interactions, the powers of the monarch and royal succession. Here we go. The moving or instant capital. How can that happen? Right? And the church and its Abun and medieval times, right? Not medieval times, medieval times, right? So here we go. The moving or instant capitals. Trade throughout most of the country in this period was too limited to permit the growth of mercantile towns, except for a few settlements here and there. So they did have principal trade routes in areas, right? So the Ethiopian emperors would um they or the chiefs, who were often accompanied by hundreds of courtiers and just the entourage, uh, they didn't have a fixed capital. And most times they didn't have one. So state affairs, which consisted largely of the monarch's personal inspection of its provinces, the collection of taxes, and the frequent waging of wars against internal and external enemies, as we can see, obliged rulers had to make some adjustments. You just couldn't stay in Lalibela forever, right? So monarchs spent most of their time, according to the author, monarchs spent most of their time traveling around the countryside, but often halted wherever grain and cattle and firewood was needed. So changes in the location of capitals often resulted from the destruction of forests and things like that. But now get this. The custom of moving camps frequently was so well established that the Chronicle of Emperor Galawidos, 1540 to 1559, went so far to observe that it was the practice of kings to travel from place to place until the hour of their last sleep, the day of their eternal repose. So basically, they said these kings are supposed to be nomadic. You're supposed to go from place to place. But I do understand, as far as a leader, you got to be among the people. You gotta know what they need and see what's happening and see what's going on. See what I'm saying? I was told that a shepherd is not a shepherd until they smell like sheep. You know? All right, let's get all my papers are falling and everything. So the emperor's army and his camps were in many cases immense. It was a large army, and it was unbelievable according to Alvarez. So they traveled for miles, and the royal camps, according to Alvarez, were always situated on the plain, and it was 50,000 mules, and and they would go from 50,000 to 100,000, depends on the situation, right? When we include other animals, and so the royal camp, the royal camp, according to Alvarez, were always situated in the plain, for they needed vast amount of space. Yeah, you got a lot of people, so you need a lot of space. So those of the emperor, they had a tent. It was pitched at the highest available ground. So the king was always at the high ground, right? They had about 4 or 5 tents in number. They stood in a cluster almost facing west, western expansion. They're facing west. That is away from the rising sun. That is totally different than what we when we talked about the Sphinx and the temples where the door they was facing east. Okay, towards the sun. The kings of Ethiopia, their tents were facing west. It's interesting. So they had the moving or instant capital. They moved from place to place. So, and then it had several other tents were reserved for religious purposes. Yeah, they had several other tents for religious purposes. So now, before I get to the religion, though, the land in front of the royal tents were for a distance of 800 yards, and they had their military there. They had their royal guards and pages near the royal tents. They they was guarded. You just couldn't walk up in there. And so several other tents were reserved for religious purposes. The two largest of the tents were described by Alvarez were those of St. Mary, situated in the north, and the tent of the Holy Cross. So then we had the religious fact, the priest there. And so we had what they call the tent of judges. Okay, there were likewise fairly large tents reserved for the principal courtiers of the state. Among them were two Betswadas, or beloved ministers of the state. Okay, the tent of judges likewise took up much of the space. Okay, and the Abun or patriarch also had many tents. Okay, so the tents of these people were followed by persons of lesser rank. So the tent of judges, these were the legal officials. These were the people who knew the rules and regulations to make sure things was on point, right? Then we had the court of justice. So we had the tent of judges, then the court of justice, right? This camp was also contained a long tent which served as a court of justice, and two other tents as prisons. If you out of pocket out there, they got a jail for you. Beyond them was a sizable marketplace where there was trading. People had to still have to work. People still have to make money and everything. So further on again were the tents of the two chief justices. Between them, the third tent, which was the church of the justices. In front of them were chained 4 lions. Shout out to the family. We talked about the Sphinx and segment. There's the lions again. They have 4 lions, traditional Ethiopian symbols of royalty. It's in the book. So these camps, they were all together with the king's camp. We had the 10 of judges. We had the entourage and everything else. So yeah, for everyone knows this his place. They know where they're supposed to be and his proportion. There being never any alteration of the order, but the same streets and lanes, the same distances of tents, so that where it not for the variation of the prospect, other mountains or rivers, another face of the country, you would think yourself in the same place. They had it so organized when they went from place to place, according to the Portuguese, it almost looked the same. Everybody was in their place. That is order, in a sense. That is ma'at. That is order. And of course, they had the soldiers there, right? But now, shout out to Firmo. I forgot. I got started without my glasses, so I'm struggling. But yeah, get 50% off Firmo promo code RJQE50. Let's go. All right. But who is the Abun? Who is the Abun? The Ethiopian church in this period was headed in accordance to a long established tradition by an Obun or patriarch sent at the emperor's request from the Coptic church. So they were still connected to the Coptic church. They haven't fully emancipated themselves from the Coptic church, so they still were in fellowship and in communication with the Coptic church, right? So, this latter church, it would be recalled that had a millennium or so earlier ordained Ethiopia's first Christian bishop, Frumentius, later on Abba Salama. The Ethiopian church and its patriarch enjoyed immense prestige, wealth, and influence. Many of the more important churches and monasteries are endowed with considerable land. They had property, they had money, and all these things. So the Abun was also provided with extensive lands, and though a foreigner, could at times play a major role in the state affairs, even as we have seen in some instances influencing the selection of the monarch. So the Abun may or may not be from Ethiopia, but the Coptic Church appointed them to be there. And the Abun has so much power and so much pull that they can sway the decision maker when it come down to the king. Who's made king next? Who's next? Or the king's decision depends on the situation, right? Yeah, the Abun was ordained and brought to Ethiopia by the Egyptian Coptic Church, even in the Middle Ages. All right, now barter and primitive money. The Ethiopian, they remember the Axum kingdom had coin money. But since then they started to get into trade, right? And so the Ethiopian highlands throughout time as previously had they was very self-sufficient and they had a subsistence economy, which means they made enough for themselves. Okay. And so trade largely took the form of barter. The exchange, for example, as Alvarez says, of a cow, a sheep, or chicken. He called it, this dude, Alvarez from Portugal, called it primitive money. This is the Middle Ages, right? Remember, this is the 1500s. Portugal and Spain was blessed by the Moors. They was 700 to 800 years of this was already happening up there. So when he get down to Africa, they up here using primitive money. They trading and stuff. We got coins up there. They got cows down here. Yeah, yeah. That's their vision. That's their point of view. So the primitive money, according to him, consisted of commodities and considerable demand, and which were geographical or other reasons it could not be easily obtained. So the most important articles was rock salt, okay, and so they used salt, and so they used the items like that. And now there was some two other types. Though there's two other types of primitive money which also circulated. One was pieces of cloth. I don't know how you can measure that, but they had pieces of cloth, and the other was thin bars of iron. So they went from cloth. They tried to use iron. Why? Because you can weigh it. You can actually break it down and weigh that. So most farmers or other landowners paid their taxes to their local chief or immediate overlord in mainly in grain or cattle. They also use honey and butter too. So money was virtually up in this point, the 1500s, in the Middle Ages of Ethiopia was unknown, right? So they traded. They did a lot of trade. Now, relations with Muslim neighbors. Here we go. Now, Ethiopia's neighbors were diverse as its landscape. So, to the east, the Muslim sultanates of Ifat and later Adal were both trade partners and rivals at the same time. They shared markets, intermarried in some cases, and exchanged diplomatic envoys. But they fought in wars. They fought over territory, resources, and influence. So to the north, across the Red Sea, they had the Christian kingdoms like Nubia. Remember, Nubia was at one time a Christian nation. Okay, it provided cultural and religious solidarity, though they too faced pressures from the expanding Islamic powers. So Ethiopia's rulers saw themselves as part of a wider Christian world, a world that included not just Africa but Europe and other places. And so they had letters that was sent to and from Jerusalem and other places that have occasionally they people would travel from Ethiopia to other places, even to Rome. So it was more of a diplomatic balancing act in that sense, right? To be strong enough to protect the faith in a sense and flexible enough to trade and negotiate and coexist. So during the first centuries of the Solomonic dynasty, the Shawa based Christian state was in close contact with its Muslim neighbors and with Christian co religionaries in Jerusalem and far off Europe. Christian Sawa was tied to Muslim Egypt. It was they was tied. They remember the Coptic Church was in Egypt, but also the Muslims was in Egypt too. And to Ifat and Adal, the Muslim Emirates between the Ethiopian highlands and the sea, they 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 needed Egypt to be on their side politically. They needed it. All right. And so Sawa was likewise heavily dependent on Ifat and Abdal, like I said, because of their location on the trade routes to the Gulf of Aden and other ports. So Egypt was the gateway to the north. For them to make that money, they had to be cool with them. They had to tolerate them. Okay. Despite interdependency, the rulers of the Christian interior and the Muslim coastal lowlands often fought against each other, largely with the aim of gaining control over the trade routes. Now, the Muslim rulers of the coast, because of their proximity to the sea and greater involvement with international trade, had, on the other hand, better access than the emperors in Ethiopia. Yeah, yeah. Now, relations between Ethiopia and Egypt would soon become deteriorated. Of course, with issues and politics. So they they got tired of playing these games. They got tired of this laissez-faire kind of thing. So Muslims of Ifat determined to regain military initiative. They actually rallied against Ethiopia from time to time. And so what happened is conflict would erupt in between the Muslims of Egypt or in that area and Ethiopia. Conflict with Ifa erupted in 1332, by which time Hak al-Din, the brother of Amir, had become the ruler of Ifat. So, according to this, the emperor of Ethiopia was in conflict, was caught between. It was like the emperor of Ethiopia who just got there. Okay, was there was caught in between the beef or the issue between the Christian state and the Muslim Emirates. And so, passionately interested in this commerce, he quoted in his chronicle complaining that Afar ruler, Afar, shout out to Afar fam, Amir Hak Adin was seized as one of his subjects in certain, and who probably been on a mission to the coast. And so they when so basically the Muslims took advantage of the opportunity. They saw one of the Ethiopian leaders going out on a trade route, and they decided to get active. So they what they did in that engagement, in that battle, they unalive, they killed Amir Haq Adin. So the Muslims killed an Ethiopian ruler. Now Ethiopia had to get involved. They said, "Bro, we've been trying to be diplomatic about it. We tried to be cool with it. You took one of our boys out. Now we got to get involved." So conflict erupted. Yeah. So there was some invasions. So the struggle in the east continued during the reign of Amda son Emperor Safad. Who this is even though we're skipping timelines. That when we talked about Alvarez, that was the 1500. Alvarez is 1500. The author kind of jumped back into the 1300s. Okay, and so, but this was a struggle going on, and uh, so the struggle in the East continued during the reign of Amda, Sion's son, Emperor Saya Arad, who faced by rebellion in Ifat. On one occasion reportedly dispatched considerable force of 30,000 soldiers to the area. One of his successors subsequently chased a local rebel, Sultan Sad Adin, as far as the Gulf of Aden. So they weren't playing with him. That was another way. I think there was another way that Ethiopia maintained their power by pushing out or keeping the invaders at bay. All right. But now there were also some other ties. There were some medieval ties with Muslim and Coptic Egypt. I talked about that earlier. So, despite the occasional religious animosity, the Ethiopian uh, irritation at failures by the Egyptian to dispatch aboons as requested, the relations between the two countries were often cordial. So they try, even though sometimes whenever they send a letter or an email to the Coptic Church to send them a new aboon, the Coptic Church was slow. But even though they were slow, they were still respectful. They were still cool, right? And so this was notably the case during the reign of Emperor Yasak. This was 1412 to 27, when a group of Mamluks led by one Al Tabinga made their way to Ethiopia as refugees. Okay, Mamluks went down to Ethiopia as refugees. The Egyptian, who was known, according to the Arab historian Makrizi, for his skill in arms and equestrian art, was received by the emperor with dignity and honor. Even though there have been some issues from time to time, they would still try to receive people with peace and respect. Okay, yeah, that's what it's about. So Yasak, unlike his predecessors, was stood out from the crowd and by being that ruler, by being that king, right? So remember King uh, Yamarana Christos, when we discussed, though he was a Muslim, he was favorable to the Christians of Ethiopia. So it was a back and forth. It was even exchange in a sense. To whom he was when he went to Jerusalem, he was granted the chapel of the invitation to the of the Christ in the I'm sorry, the invention of the Christ in the church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And he received a station or a place in the grotto of the Nativity nearby Jerusalem. So there was always some kind of cordial or mutual respect. The only time they got active is either one of their leaders was taken out, or um there was some money involved. So um of course they was also in link and connected with Christian Europe also. And guess what? The Moors entered the chat. Okay, most Ethiopians making their way to Rome were attached to the Church of Santo Stefano, later known as Santo Stefano de Mori, the Moors. So, which became a cradle of Ethiopian studies in Europe. So, Rome was a major hub for the Ethiopians also. They were cool with the Europeans, even though, in my opinion, they sometimes was doing the most. They were trying to get that knowledge about the Ark of the Covenant, but that's what that is. So that was that was them. So now when it came down to Europe, I think that over time they start to realize that Europe didn't really respect them or regard them. So even though Ethiopia had their own knowledge, had their own information, Europe just saw them as another African nation, and you know how that goes, right? So now, uh, in this medieval world, okay, of mountain fortresses and coastal markets, of liturgies of in Ge'ez and deals struck over incense and gold, money and power, politics, and even cattle, laid the foundation for everything that came next. So from here, we're about to go into, say, the latter periods where new powers arise, new powers come up, new threats emerge, right? And Ethiopia's identity is tested yet again. So next time we are going to deal with the figures of the Horn of Africa, a man whose very name struck fear in the highlands, named Ahmad Ibn Ibrahim, known in history as Ahmad Grangan. So we'll talk about that. We're going to get into chapter 5 of the book. We'll deal with chapter 5, Ahmad Ibn Ibrahim, and Oromo migration, right? And a little bit of Ottoman Empire. We'll get into that too. All right, we get into that too. So yeah, we talked about Ethiopian Kemet Kush, a sacred unified art. That this is our overarching series here. And so we talked about king's authority and power, Ethiopian life in the Middle Ages, right? So if you want to learn more about Ethiopia, Kemet, and Kush, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, right? Now, of course, this was Pillar 1, Ethiopia, the source and the sanctuary. Pillar 2, Kemet, the blueprint of sacred civilization. Pillar 3, Kush and Nubia, the corridor of continuity. Pillar 4, the hidden code in spiritual science, right? So here's some books, okay? The Fata Nagas and the Kebra Nagas, okay, by E.A. Wallace Bush. Check them out. The affiliate link is in the description. And all right, here's another one. Okay, the book. Okay, on this side, the Africans who wrote the Bible. Okay, shout out to Yahya Shabaka. He told me about that book. I need to check that out. And in the Book of Mysteries by E.A. Wallace Budge, the Book of Mysteries of the Heavens and the Earth. All right, check it out. Now, this is the book that we have. This is the Ethiopia's A History by Richard Pankhurst, where we're pushing into chapter 5. The link is in the description. As an Amazon affiliate, I earn from qualifying purchases. Check it out. This is my book, though. The Crusades and Jihad in East Africa, Religious Conflicts and Their Impact. Yeah, this is my new book. This is where we talk a little bit more about those conflicts in that book, right? Check it out. Now, the Njumbe members, shout out to the Njumbe members, shout out to the fam, Abina Scott, Brother Mo, Brother Isu. They are members. They get the heads up on the new information, the new content, and they get a more insight as to what's going on, and they sometimes get the vote as to what we're about to do next, right? So join the membership. So today we talked about the king's authority and power. We talked about social structure and daily life, economic activities and trade routes, political organization, and kingdom interactions, the powers of the monarch and royal succession, the moving or instant capitals. They couldn't be at the same place all the time. The church and its Abun, and how much power he had in medieval times, right? If you like the content, share it with somebody that may enjoy it, or and well, forget or and to your social media platform of choice, right? Listen to King Cam Ujumbe Podcast and Ujumbe means message, and today's message is a king's authority and power, Ethiopian life in the Middle Ages. If you want to catch up on this series, the Ethiopian series here, I got a playlist. If you want to catch up on the Zagwe dynasty that we just talked about, I got that for you too. All right. This is the King Cam Ujumbe Podcast. Ujumbe means message. And I will talk to you later. Peace.